Hello, everyone. Wanted to start off with just being very specific with the online students in terms of what your assignments are. As you know, I'm recording a class that's face-to-face just to give you the energy and the presence that I know I project when I'm in front of people, rather than me talking at a screen where I feel I'm much less personal and maybe compelling. And I do want to maintain your attention and keep your attention. So let me start by, maybe losing your attention a little bit by looking over Canvas and seeing what's due. I just want to make sure we know what the requirements are for this class. As I load this screen here, what you have due this Sunday and every Sunday will be the notes from our classes. So from our 2 classes this week, and then a short quiz. So note right here, class number 1 notes, class number 2 notes. And let me make sure here I have, it's exactly the same schedule as Econ 2, but I want to show you Econ 4, prove that to you. Anytime I'm showing you due dates for either class, they're exactly the same. The assignments are different, but they're exactly the same. So note here, same assignments. Click on these to upload. Remember what I said in our first video, it's probably best to use the Canvas app on your phone and the camera on your phone. Take a picture of your notes and upload them. If you don't have a phone, of course, you can use your document camera or your laptop camera to take a picture and then upload that. Note that by the time that you watch our 3rd video, so our first video of next week, make sure beforehand you've read chapter 2, because I'm going to have some questions there that I'll require you to answer that serve as kind of a quiz where you have to answer those in your notes. And then just like at the end of today's session, there are going to be some questions around your reading assignment that I wanted you to do before class or before watching this class today, and that is reading the articles in the chapter 1 learning module. There'll be some questions at the end of this class that'll be the same. I'm grading your notes not only on completion, but are you understanding the materials presented in class? And so there, at least you're getting some time today of some discussion around the topics before I quiz you. Sometimes I'll quiz at the beginning. So you need to be prepared before each class. Now, if I go to, so one thing I can do is I can always just go to the calendar and click on the assignment itself, and it'll bring me to that assignment. Let me now, though, go back out. And let's look at the entire homepage and look how to navigate to these assignments and all your assignments. So note, if I go to modules, and then there's a student view here, I go down in the module to online assignments, you'll see, first of all, our first lecture, and then where I want you to upload your notes. Your notes need to be handwritten, not typed. If you're using an electronic device, you need to use a stylus pen, so it is handwriting, not typed out, because we're going to get more and more into drawing graphs and doing calculations that you're not going to be able to do while you're typing. So go to these either here on your computer, go to these on the app for Canvas, which is free. Take a picture of your complete notes, press upload, upload that file, and then press submit down here. Now the quiz, similarly, click on quiz number 1 here. There you're getting one question as a gimme, but it comes from a large database, so not all of you are going to get that question there. Note that you're going to have 1 attempt, and it's worth 5 points with 8 questions, and you get 10 minutes. Make sure to do all 3 of those assignments by midnight on Sunday, and I'll be placing this video here above chapter 2 notes. Please let me know if you have any questions. The lecture will begin in just one moment.
Just write definition of economics of social science and stop right there and listen. Definition of economics, a social science. Stop and listen after you write a social science. Those who are in my first class, you're going to notice that I watch what I happened in the previous class and I'm going to learn from it. Maybe the second class can be a little bit better. So a social science can stop. Who takes science? Who's taken biology, chemistry, physics? Anybody taking classes like that? That's a hard science, we call those classes. I call economics a soft science. You know, science tends to be around things that you can prove without any debate, right? What sciences have you taken? Tell me what it was. Human biology, I mean, could you argue with the teacher a different opinion about how the human body works? Not really. What else? What other sciences did you take? Who do you have? Who do you guys have? With that lady, okay. Do you know my name? Yeah, there we go, right? You're in economics, right? All right. So at least you'll know my name. In any science, you can make definite predictions about what's going to happen, and they're going to be true because it's science. It is hard physical laws. Now, I'm going to predict your behavior, what every one of you does after class. How am I going to do? What's going through your head? I like think, does he really know? Is he going to go watch? And I can like see this tension in your. I don't know. I don't know what you're going to do after class. How can I get? I can do a model. I can create a mathematical model of college students' behavior. Some smoke weed. Some play video games. Some have jobs. I can do probabilities of weed smoking in the afternoon versus going to a job versus actually doing a reading. I could run those numbers through this computer program. I can make a prediction. Is it going to be absolutely true? Well, partially, right? Maybe. I think I got you on a few of the things, right? But I don't know for everybody, right? So we are a social science, meaning it's really hard for us to make absolutely perfect predictions, right? But at least we're trying. And I think a lot of my colleagues in the social sciences tend to be very, they don't tend to be humble. They say, this is going to happen, and they turn out to be wrong. And don't look at me. I didn't predict that. And at least I want to say we're a social scientist. It's hard to really pin things down. Okay, now, right? Concerned with the efficient use of limited or scarce resources, stop after the word resources. Stop after the word resources. I want every homeless person to have a nice house. No, a nice apartment. I want every person in America to have a basic minimum income. I want, and disagree with me, but just listen to my laundry list. I want everyone to have health care. I want us to go to Mars tomorrow. I want us to just soup up our Mars thing. I don't know what else. I want you all to get full financial aid. I want all green energy next year. Now, why are you looking at me like that? Well, what's wrong with that statement? It's crazy. It's infeasible, right? Because we have limited resources, right? There are all kinds of great things we can do, but we don't have unlimited resources and funds and time, right? So we have to make choices. Now, economics is often called the dismal science, right? If I talk about the environment, that's a dismal topic at times. Homelessness, a dismal topic. But the point of economics is to use mathematical models of human behavior and outcomes of certain policies to try to figure out what's the most efficient use of our resources to try to solve as many problems as possible. There is data out there around homelessness. I probably won't get to it today that shows that if you lower the rent for homes or you raise the number of availability of homes, meaning you build more homes, there's less homelessness. So what would that tell you need to do in a city? You need to be building more homes and homelessness will go down. Instead of just giving everyone an apartment, that's the more rational solution. So we look at hard problems, but we look at mathematical models to try to help us find efficient solutions. So that's the next part. Now finish it off with to achieve maximum satisfaction of human material wants. I'm going to send around the sign-in sheet, please. Make sure you sign in. This class, more than macroeconomics, for those of you who are in macro as well, is more about individual behavior and decisions. And so we're going to get into some psychology. In fact, I'll spend at least one class, if not two, Thanksgiving week, where, sorry to be the bearer of bad news, we don't get the whole week off. Yeah, sorry. It's been that way at Butte College forever. We have class Monday and Wednesday. I'm not going to, if you need to go see your grandmother for Thanksgiving, I'm not going to dock you points, but I'm going to deliver a really thoughtful lecture that is part of my, I guess it's my passion project of bringing in a little bit more psychology, a little bit more on abnormal psych to economics. And I'll do a lecture about happiness as it relates to making money, how our material wants maybe lead to some satisfaction, but also some of the strange things about our behavior, that sometimes we act and behave in ways that are actually counterproductive to our own happiness. So some bad news, right? That we do have class. Good news. I'm not, if you need to go see grandma. I'll record those lectures, but also good news that we're going to spend some time on psychology and some of the things I really love about human behavior. And that is the things that are really difficult to predict and those things where we work against our own purposes. So while economics does this, economics in its textbook form, as you guys are reading, economics talks about human beings being totally rational. Are you totally rational? Do you make rational decisions? Do you make rational decisions sometimes? I hope so, right? Sometimes. We come from the standpoint that we are always rational. Now that's right. It's laughable. It's laughable. Of course, we're not. We're humans. We're emotional beings. And so that week, I'm going to spend some time on my specialty in economics of, well, wait a minute. Okay, now let's be real. Let's talk about it's something called behavioral economics, where we really look at the fact that, no, we're not always rational. Okay, so there's my definition of economics, breaking it down into some things that I'm going to add and some things that I call into question. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to write down in your own words definition to these four terms. You take some time and come up with the definition of specialization, division of labor, economies of scale, and economies of scope in your own words. So take a moment to do that. Press pause. When you're back, what I hope you do is listen to what I'm going to add to this and change your definitions to make sure they are technically correct, because part of the learning process is taking a stab at something. And then when we realize we didn't have something completely understood, changing that or ameliorating that, in fancy words, is actually a really excellent pathway towards learning. And so I want to add something here. So specialization, and in fact, let me change a spelling here. Specialization, as it is expressed in labor market, something we're going to talk more about in the future. If a worker is more specialized, if a worker has more skills, if their skills are more scarce, and if the worker is more productive, this is what leads to people being paid more money. If you're thinking about your future occupations, you want to be thinking as a college student, what is it that I'm really getting out of this education that's going to help me be more specialized, skilled? Am I entering into something that is relatively scarce so that my pay will be higher if that's your interest? And how am I going to be more productive at this work than others, right? How am I going to be relatively more specialized than other workers? And even other workers in your field. I remember in high school, I was an auto shop kid. I took auto shop classes because I was a little lost in terms of whether or not I was really going to be a college student. And something changed my life when one of the recruiters from, I think it was WyoTech or one of the tech schools, one of the trade schools, came into our class and looked at us and summed us up as looked like a bunch of slackers. And he said, listen, you are going to make the amount of money that compares with, that is commensurate with, that is dependent upon the number and complexity of the problems that you solve. The more complex and numerous problems are that you solve in a given day is directly related to how much you're paid. And so that's, I think, a really good way of understanding what specialization is in microeconomics. That is, becoming more skilled, solving tough problems, and making more money from that specialization. So specialization is practice, 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 working on one skill and becoming relatively more skilled, adept, proficient, efficient than other workers. Division of labor. If this is done effectively in a corporation, in a company, that's going to lead to less costs and higher productivity, higher levels of efficiency. So just like I put under specialization, write down that more specialized, skilled, and scarce and productive. But also, if you would, write this down below division of labor. Because what division of labor is if you have many different workers who are skilled in different areas, and if you effectively make sure on your assembly line, in your restaurant, in any endeavor that requires different skills, that you have the most specialized, efficient worker at each part of the production or service process, that's going to lower a business's cost. That's going to increase their product quality. It's going to increase productivity, which, all other things equal, holding revenue constant, that means more profit. Economies of, I want you to write down these three phrases, terms. These are reasons why you might get economies of scale. And economies of scale are simply the reality that comes from making more of something at scale. Quantity means scale. So at a greater scale, a greater quantity means that costs are lower. So as more of something is made, that thing is made more efficiently or with lower costs.
Cost per unit. Along the horizontal axis, we're going to put quantity. The quantity is really a synonym for that word scale. Put a 0 down here at the beginning of both axes. Then draw a dot right here. Those three words you just wrote are three phrases: learning by doing, specialization, indivisible set of costs. What does that dot represent? Use your logic here. What does that dot represent? That's the indivisible set of costs. That is your, yeah, precisely, investment, another word for it. But if you're going to build an airplane, you're going to build a car, you need to build a factory. And when you build a factory, that's going to have a certain cost, and you're going to be at 0. So initially, your costs are quite high. So what do you want to do? You want to lower them by making a lot of airplanes, making a lot of cars. This is why we have one jet manufacturer in the United States, Boeing. Why? Hey, let's pool our money and start an airplane company. Is that a good idea? Even Elon Musk hasn't done that, right? Probably not a great idea, because you're going to have to invest billions just to have the capability to produce one aircraft. I used to work for Boeing. I'm going to show you pictures of their manufacturing facility. It is the biggest building by square volume in the United States of America. You walk in there and it looks, I don't know, like a whole world inside there. They've got massive jumbo jets, one after the other, on an assembly line, right? So that's an indivisible setup cost. You've got to set that up billions of dollars just to be able to produce an item. And then as you produce that item, so let's add something here, what's going to happen to your cost per unit? As you can divide by something, right? As you divide by 2 to 10 to 3 to 4, notice this is an economy of scale. So draw that line going down. As you get more specialized workers, it's going to make your cost per unit go down. And as you get better at what you're doing, right? Learning by doing just means that you're making more and more of something, and therefore you're getting more efficient at making that thing. If I was to say to you, so now I want to put this in context that you'll hear in business. The company has yet to exhaust its scale. What do you think I mean there? Where is the company on this line here? It is yet to exhaust all of its scale. It has economies yet to exhaust. Has it produced to here? Right, so if you yet have economies to exhaust, that means that you could produce more. And if you produce more, your cost per unit is lower. And so long as the price is the same, your profit is higher, right? Assuming you can sell that number of goods. What if I was to say, the company has this new product, but they need to bring it to scale? I mean, yeah, more, quite simple. So note that this economies of scale is used in the business press in various variations, and I'll try to make you familiar with those over the course of the semester. This right here we'll spend a lot more time on later in the semester. Just wanted to give you somewhat of a heads up on what it is. Okay, economies of scope. Using abilities to expand into similar businesses. I heard some good answers there as I was listening in on you guys. Is that what you wrote down? You're good at one thing, that's going to make you good at something else. You don't have to write, well, you can write Musk Ventures, but let's write them down in our notes. What has Mr. Musk done? What are his companies? So write that down in your notes. Tesla. What else? SpaceX. What else? PayPal. Oh, we forgot that last class. Yeah, PayPal. The Boring Company. So creating tunnels for cars to go faster between 2 points. And then, yeah, Neuralink. Oh my God, I have it at home. It's a lifesaver. Thank you. I even forgot that one. That is Starlink. That thing is badass. Sorry, I'm really excited about that. I live up in Cohasset. I live up in the Potfields. I've got my own ranch up there. Hopefully, you know, I know what my neighbors do, and they know we keep our distance. But my point being, I'm way out in the boonies, and I don't get good internet until Elon Musk came on YouTube. Up there? Yeah. Really? I'm down below you on Violets. I'm at the sharp turn on Violets. At the hill right there. Yeah. But I know Four Corners. I ride up there every now and then. Yeah. We should tell them Cohasset story, right? We should probably tell them about the Aprils. No. Okay, sorry. There's no way to get good internet up there until Elon Musk has this project where they have these hundreds of satellites all around. And the problem with them is that now when you look at the night sky, you're seeing satellites more than you would before. So you're not seeing the night sky, kind of virgin night sky. But what you can do is get high-speed internet anywhere. In fact, when we were on COVID and we were doing class remotely, I was doing class remotely with my Starlink all over the country. It was fantastic. So can't believe I forgot that one. Now, what do these things have in common? Yeah. That's giving him a lot of credit, but I think that is what they're doing. Yeah. Other businesses. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, tech-based solution to big problems, it seems, that would scare other people away, right? Like I said, you know, starting a car company, good luck competing against Ford. He's just said, I'm going to do it, right? A lot of these, one thing he's had in common is there have been government seed money to help him out. That's another thing he doesn't talk about much. But this is an example of economies of scope, right? You're good at one thing, solving a technical problem, and then you have the confidence that you can do another thing, another big thing to solve a technical problem. All right, so let's move on from this. So now I want us to move on to some terms that are going to relate to your writing assignment and some things around reasoning. Positive economics isn't something like people's wages have gone up in the last year. Positive economics has to do with objective facts, data, something that's not that debatable. Yes, people debate statistics, but at least it's a statistic that's measuring something, not just an opinion. Normative economics, it's when it's your subjective opinion. tried this last class. Let me see what happens this time. Do any of you have a specific feeling about something economic that you really feel is true? Something over the last several years, something during COVID. Did we do something wrong during COVID that might have affected our economy? Did something right? Any thoughts? What's that? To shut it down? Yeah, great example. Okay, my daughter was up there protesting building it. So she has a normative belief that it's a terrible thing. You have a normative belief that it's a good thing, possibly. Let's say for the sake of argument, right? So that would be your, for the sake of argument, your belief versus her belief. Who's right? Now, what? Well, the debate needs to be focused on positive, objective facts and data. According to an economist, we can all have our opinions, we can all have our normative beliefs, but we need to hold those to scrutiny. And so I try with my daughter to have debates about, okay, you're against oil going through an area where there's a Native American reservation where it might leak into their water supply. I get that, that's a risk, but what are the benefits of having cheap oil, and doesn't it hurt poor people when oil becomes more expensive? Do you have any thoughts on it? What's the, I mean, if you shut that down, then inflation is higher, get it from other countries. It's from countries that aren't our friends. Yeah. And maybe buy it from Russia, who are killing people with that money, rather than from our friend of Canada, right? So there's all kinds, what economics does, which I think is brilliant, that really attracted me to economics, was not just somebody spewing their opinion, but spewing their opinion that's backed up by facts and data. And then he and I could, let's say, if we were on different sides of this debate, I could say, well, the long-term consequences of using fossil fuel are so bad. Here are the numbers to prove my point. You would have your argument with your facts and data, and at least we could have a reasoned debate and not end up calling each other stupid or wrong. You know, at least we could have a reasoned debate about something. And so here, write this down, minimum wage. So we're going to combine the two in another way. So this is something we're going to discuss in detail. Minimum wage and how it works and the arguments on either side of it. Who's for a higher minimum wage? Who wants it to be 20 an hour? Let's see hands. Why? Why? Hold on. Why?
Because I think to show record profits, I think it would just a better benefit.
Okay, good. Somebody else. Why?
National wage could be raised to minimum livable wage, something that the person can use pretty much to make sure that they are fed and living under.
That if you work 40 hours a week full time, you should not be below the poverty line. Would that be a good way of summing up?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. What's your belief and why? Okay, so that's the other side of it, right? So the other side, who's against raising the minimum wage? Yeah, business students. I knew business students would be that way. Yeah, because it's going to lead to higher cost of living. Poverty line is going to go up, possibly. Absolutely. And so states have different minimum wages. Yeah.
For example, some like the city in the Bay Area, a lot of small, when the minimum wage raised even higher, a lot of small businesses had to raise costs a lot to even shut down.
Right.
Right after COVID started, so bad already.
Right.
Like all the small businesses like like engagement of the week, they just understand, but they don't have to pay the minimum wage.
I hear you.
I was gonna say pretty much the same thing. I was like, how are the profit's probably gonna stay the amount same, and they're probably gonna raise the value of everything else. And then on top of that, they're gonna probably understaff the workers.
Very good. Now, who's right? Now, we could just go with what your feelings are. We could look at the evidence, right? And the evidence is all over the place. The evidence at some places backs you up that, in fact, when you raise the minimum wage, employment doesn't change that much. If you look in a couple of states and some studies, when they raised their minimum wage, there was no decrease in employment. And if there was, it was very minimum. For every 10% raise in minimum wage, there was only 1% loss in jobs.
right? So that's an argument for her point of view. Yeah,
Would that specify the small businesses or?
all businesses. And actually, I think I have it in one of the modules where it breaks down between the two. Hold up. Let me keep going on another thought here and I'll come back to you. But then another study was done in Seattle where Seattle raised their minimum wage a couple of years back. I believe something like from 10 to 20, just like bam, a huge jump. And then what did grocery stores do in downtown Seattle? They raised their prices so much that the poor were less well off.
How does that work? Because you make more and you gotta pay more, that defeats the American dream.
Right, so they raised the price of labor, you're making more, but now the costs have gone up and it made things worse for them.
Which is equal to the same.
It didn't equal it out, it made it worse in Seattle. Now, here's the learning from it. The data seems to express that if you're gonna raise a minimum wage, you don't do it in one giant jump. Right, because as some of you were saying, that's a real shock to small business owners. If you're gonna do it, California's done something right. What do we do? 50 cents to $1 every year, right? Slowly raising it. And that seems to mitigate or lessen any of the problems related to it. And so, no, this is why I love this study. This economics is that we can all have our belief system, but we need to look at the data to see, okay, what does it really show? And what's the best way to solve societal problems? Rather than us just yelling at each other, right? Because I could have let that go. And it could have gotten ugly, right? But instead, let's inform it with data and then see each other's sides on this. Did you two want to add something before I move on?
I was gonna say, like, how you were talking about how it like every 10% increases like 1%.
Yeah.
It talks about how unemployment like increases by 1%.
Precisely.
But it doesn't talk about reduction of hours.
No, it doesn't. And that's another data point.
Yeah, it's still counted as employed, but you know, they could go from, you know.
It's a killer point because our statistics on unemployment count somebody who's part-time as being employed when in fact they might not have enough hours to feed their family. The killer point.
This is very like a federal law with, like, for all businesses that if you don't have a certain amount of employees, you don't have to pay them employees.
Yes.
And businesses to just keep their employee rights from this number, that they didn't have to pay.
I mean, you could. I mean, imagine future business owners. Are you going to make decisions about the expansion of your business as whether or not you have to pay a minimum wage, right? You could, but I think if you've got a growing business with growing revenue, you're going to want to grow your business regardless of whether you got to pay higher minimum wage. But I understand maybe there's some that are right there at the margin that might say, no, I'm not going to grow. Yeah.
But considering jobs that are not at minimum, they're not getting job increases. Like when the minimum wage go up, that doesn't mean that corporations or businesses have to increase their management wage.
Right.
And now they're educated and then we're just like growing closer and closer to someone who's skilled.
And you certainly have, we'll talk more about this in a future class. Then you have this problem of the line workers making almost as much as a manager. And then the manager feels like, why am I doing this extra work?
Like, where those-
Yeah, exactly. Okay. So a couple more phrases here, and I'm going to get you to work together. All other things equal, or ceteris paribus, is a way of making a bold prediction, but holding the future constant. If I said before this summer, what's going to happen to the Congress? Congress is definitely going to go to the Republicans in 2024. Conservatives. Going to see your heads go, yeah, hell yeah, hell yeah. Wait a minute, but wait, ceteris paribus. I would have said that before Roe versus Wade was overturned. Congress is going back to the Republicans. Ceteris paribus, all other things equal. But all other things equal means if nothing changes, and then something changed. Roe versus Wade was overturned. Abortion is now not a right for women across the country. Can I make that same prediction about the Congress? No. And so note what it enables you to do, to make a bold statement saying, ceteris paribus, all other things equal, meaning if something doesn't change and then something changed. Not that we're not diving into abortion or Republican Democrat right now. We'll go there later. In fact, we will. So one way I would say ceteris paribus is minimum wage leads to inflation, all other things equal, but that's not always the case. Don't write that down. That's just an example of using that phrase. Purposeful simplifications are things that we use to understand a complex reality without getting into too much detail. don't write this, write down purposeful simplifications, but did you note that for economies of scale, we had just 3 variables, 3 things that made costs go down? What else could make your costs go down in a company as you grow larger? Yeah. Yeah, lower interest, very nice, very good. What else? Replacing, I didn't have that on my list. Very good. What else? If you're making more, you might need to buy more inputs, so you're buying in bulk, so your costs go down, right? So note that when I provide you with some models about industry, human, company behavior, I'm simplifying it because I don't know, do you want to spend the rest of your life in learning this material? And just, no, you don't, I don't, right? We need to simplify a little bit to understand the most heavy hitter reasons why certain things happen, not every single reason. Because we're dealing with human beings, right? It's a complex world. Now, write this down, confirmation bias. That human beings tend to look only for information that supports their opinion and deny information that goes against their opinion. We all do this. Our identities, who we think we are, our sense of self, our personalities are often based on what we believe to be true. So reading something and taking something in that goes against our belief system really is an offense to us. On the other end, it's been shown that when we say something we believe, we get a rush of dopamine. And so we like staying in our certain viewpoints, even if there's data to prove that we're wrong. And so I hope in this class, we're going to exercise our intellectual minds, our thinking minds, to hold space for another point of view. And we're going to practice that in all the peer discussions when you argue with people respectfully, saying, I respectfully disagree with this point for these reasons. And then I'm going to ask you to find some compromise to try to work against this confirmation bias. So let me ask you this, don't write this down. When I gave you those different points of view on minimum wage to you and to, I forget who else was the proponent for not having minimum wage. I think you were vocal about that. Did you get enriched? Did you take in the other side of the information, or did you just kind of go, no, that's bullshit?
No, I mean, at least inflation.
And did you get the point that it only lost 1% of jobs, or no, that 10% increase in minimum wage only lost 1% of jobs? I mean, that's an argument for it. You had a good counter argument, but could you hear that?
My parents own businesses, so like I know from there.
Right. Indeed. So there's maybe a little confirmation bias, right? That information, because it really is important to you, right? So we're going to try in this class to try to push through that. We all experience this. Dunning-Kruger is something else that's important to be aware of, and that is the less people know about something, the more sure they are about that thing. Psychology professors came up with this idea and they tested it by putting on a final for their students. At the end of the final, what grade did you think you got? And so the students who got F's put that they thought they got A's and B's. So be careful when you walk up to me when you're midterm and say, I aced this. I sometimes wink and I sometimes say Dunning-Kruger. Sometimes I can tell I better not say anything because they're going to cry if I say anything. But when I hear people come up and say, I aced this, I think, oh man, you don't remember Dunning-Kruger. That's not a good sign. Now, the opposite's also true. People who got A's said they got D's and C's. So not only if you're sure, you know less, if you are less sure, you know more. And get the logic there, right? Why is an A student an A student? Because they don't believe they're an A student. They work that much harder. Why is a D student a D student? But they become too sure they know everything. But be aware of that in your own preparation as a student and as an adult, right? Okay, post hoc fallacy. I'm going to get you guys to work together. If one event takes place and another event takes place later, one event change doesn't necessarily cause the other event to change. And then also write this phrase, correlation versus causation. I want to play around with some ideas here. friend of mine at Chico State had a statement on his office door that said there's a direct correlation between the number of pirates declining and the amount of global warming taking place. Therefore, fewer pirates, so we need more pirates to tackle global warming. Correlation or causation? Right, the data seems to be related, but one's not causing the other thing. But let me muddy the waters a little bit. This data compiled by a guy named Stephen Levitt, who wrote a book on economics called Freakonomics, where he made this thesis that when Roe versus Wade was made the law of the land in 1973, and every woman had a right to abortion in this country, that women began to have more abortions. And fewer, take this the right way, especially if you're a foster child, you know, much love and understanding to that, and I know it's an emotional subject, but take this as logic on this. That there were some people who had unwanted pregnancies who didn't feel they could care for their child, and they couldn't terminate their pregnancy until 1973. And then some began to terminate their pregnancy. So 18 years later, there weren't those children around. Whereas prior to 1973, these mothers who weren't capable, able, willing, whatever, old enough to truly raise a child well, had to raise the child and maybe weren't as perfect caregivers as they could have been. And so if you aren't cared for in a nurturing way, what might you be more apt to do? Violent crime, property crime, or murder, right? And so his thesis is this, that because Roe versus Wade was made the law of the land, and 18 years later, by the way, is the year when most people commit most of the crimes in their life. That's a known statistic. That 18 years later, those kids weren't around. And so crime dropped. And so think about this now, from this perspective, if this is true, overturning Roe v. Wade means 18 years from now, there's going to be more crime. Have I proven this to you? Is this correlation or causation? Kind of a trick question.
Where did you get this, huh?
This is, yeah. Databases on crime from the FBI, abortions, I imagine, from Planned Parenthood. Is where you get that data. Yeah,
Maybe the only way we find out is wait 18 years.
yeah, true.
That's right.
A natural experiment there. Well, here's what the right answer is. It could be both. It's definitely correlation, right? 18 years after more abortions, less crime, right? You see that right here. But it could maybe not be causal. It could be because in the 1990s, we had a huge economic boom. And when we have an economic boom, crime goes down. It could be in the early 90s, we put 100,000 new police officers to walk the street. It's called community policing. So no, you don't have to buy the causation. More abortion causes less crime. Does that mean it isn't true? No, it could very well be cause, but I have not proven it to you with this data. That makes sense, that kind of gray area there? They correlate, they may cause, but this data isn't proving that one causes the other. Sorry, say again.
What's the risk kind of like that? Because if you're like a young mother or a young parent, you're not like fully developed or mature enough to raise a kid, you're kind of like a child raising another child with the next type of kid. Is that like?
That's his thesis. That's what he's saying. That there was less of those children, therefore there was less crime. Okay. And again, you don't have to buy that argument. That's just his argument. And he's arguing causality. All right. So now,
In class today, given the lecture you just listened to and took notes on, and given the reading that I had you do, and the reading was in reading assignment under chapter 1, I want you to apply the information from Uber Got Lost, that article there, to the concepts that we learned in class and are explained in chapter 1. There are two answers that likely could have one or the other of the possible answers listed below, but there is a best fit. And so part of the way I'm going to grade your notes is not only their completion, but how well you've done on these in-class checks for knowledge. So please pause this video now. There's no more content, but you need to simply answer these questions. Now, you don't need to rewrite the question, just write one and then one of the possible answers down below. Please remember to upload your notes from this class and the previous class and take our short online quiz on chapter 1 and the lectures and material from chapter 1. Have a great weekend. We'll see you next week. Remember, everything's due by midnight this Sunday.